Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. We've been using Psalm 92 verse 2 as our theme for this series on worship. This week, we'll be considering the topic worship as performance. Worship is to be purposeful. This is something we need to center on, and we have repeatedly mentioned that it's to be purposeful. And as we've seen in 1 Corinthians 14 verse 40, it is to be done decently and in order. Religion may either be man-centered or God-centered, and certainly we want our worship to be centered on God. Edification itself cannot be authentic unless it is God-centered. You are not really building people up unless you're building them up in the Lord. Worship should be according to His Word, as we've already seen the importance of authorized worship. So with all of these things in mind, let's consider worship as performance. First of all, there are dangers of performance worship. And we need to be very clear that these dangers are real and that they are indeed a present problem in the religious world and among churches of Christ. First of all, the danger of formalism. That is to say, being focused on the performance of worship to such an extent that you don't worship in truth, in the heart. Keeping the outward forms can be done without the inner change that is to come. Formalism is a danger. Aestheticism, that is to say, being so focused on the beauty, on the effect, on how this worship is making me feel, that we lose sight of the content. And consumerism, having the congregation become an audience, and planning the worship primarily on how do we build the largest audience. Now, certainly, we want to reach out to people, and we want our worship services to be evangelistic. And yet, we must never lose sight of the fact that God is the ultimate audience. He is the one who must be pleased. And there is the danger of inauthenticity, of being fake. Whenever we focus too much on performance in our worship, we run the danger of becoming hypocrites, actors. I recall a situation where I heard a very prominent preacher deliver the same sermon twice. And in this sermon, the first time I heard it, he recounted a story that was very moving. And at a particular point in telling the story, his voice broke. And he could not get his words. He could not go on. And it was very moving. The second time I heard the presentation, in the same story, at the exact same moment, his voice broke and he couldn't go on. But hearing it that second time, I wasn't moved. I was appalled because the man was acting out emotion. It wasn't authentic. He was performing, and as a result, he had become an actor. And the Greek word for that is, of course, hypocrite. He was not authentic. So these are dangers of performance worship. And yet, as we've seen, worship is to be purposeful. Worship in order, decently and in order, indicates performance. It means there's a plan, there's an intent. Performance is just a matter of doing, and how we do things in worship matters. Production, that is to say, executing a worship service, is important because it can be God-honoring. If we intend for our worship to be God-honoring, then we must be planful, and we must take steps to execute, to perform in a way that would be God-honoring. It gives us a benchmark against which we can measure our worship. Furthermore, to be biblical, that is to say, to look at all of doctrine and to make sure that what we are doing in worship squares with what God has revealed in Scripture. We are able to do that whenever we are planful, because we are able to look at what we intend to do and to see whether it fits into the plan of God. And the question of being edifying. If we want our worship services to bless people, we must be planful in how we execute them. We should not be haphazard. This is not honoring to God to be slapstick and haphazard, nor is it honoring to other people. If we want our worship services to edify, we need to be planful in how we produce them. And if we want our worship services to be evangelistic, there needs to be a plan, there needs to be a careful execution of what we do. There is a purpose behind our worship service, and we can ask ourselves, have we truly met our target? Have we done what we have set out to do? Now, there's some pragmatic considerations that we should reflect on. First of all, the idea of preparation. Sometimes people act as if spontaneous worship is the only authentic worship. Now, I believe there is a place for a spur-of-the-moment prayer that you would offer, or a word of exhortation. But even then, the prayer and the word should be based on a life of preparation. But whenever we go to a worship service, our prayers should be planned out in advance. A man who gets up to lead in prayer ought to have in mind what he wants to say. Our song leaders need to select their songs and to make sure that they know how they are going to lead them. Our preachers need to prepare their lessons, to make sure that they have a stream of thought that can be followed. In all things, we should be prepared, because our preparation is God-honoring and it leads to an effective execution of what we set out to do. And we need to think in terms of the performance. That merely means the doing. How is it that we do things? We need to make sure that our song leaders, for example, are personally prepared to lead singing. Some men are just simply not well equipped to lead singing. Now, I believe every Christian man ought to be able to lead in each aspect of worship if the need were to arise. But in a congregation of any size, not every man should expect to lead singing. Quite simply, some are not well equipped to do that. And the same thing with delivering sermons. Not every man is a public speaker. Every Christian man ought to be able to share the gospel, but that doesn't mean that everyone should be able to stand in front of a group and deliver a sermon. But if we do these things, if we preach, for example, we should understand the basics of delivery, of how to project our voices, how to pace ourselves, how to organize our thoughts. If we're going to lead singing, we should have training in the rudiments of music. In all these things, the performance does matter. And we need to be aware of the cultural setting. This is a point which is quite a challenge for us, because religion, by its very nature, is a conservative force. And even religious groups that we think of as being theologically very liberal have a tendency to lay hold of certain forms and to keep them in place. In point of fact, the more liberal in doctrine a denomination is, the more set it is in its forms. It's not by accident that the major liberal Protestant groups are also the ones that use liturgy, and the preachers wear vestments and they follow the liturgical year, because that's what they have to hold on to. But when we look at this, we need to be very careful. Sometimes even those things that we think of as being more trendy very quickly get solidified. Among the churches of Christ, for example, I find it interesting that the songs that broke on the scene 30 or 40 years ago, and at that time were considered very trendy and in fact even an affront to the old ways of doing things, now have become situated so that they're not all that trendy. Our young people would view them as the songs of their parents or grandparents. We must remember the cultural setting. This is also true in terms of our dress code. We should not offend people by the way we dress. Now, there are various opinions as to how formal we should be when we dress for worship. We need to be careful that we don't impose our preferences on other people in a way that goes beyond what God has directed. God has directed modesty. God has directed that things should be decent and in order. And as a result, it does reflect what we choose to wear when we worship. But on the other hand, we've got to recognize that dressing up for worship is really something that is historically relatively new. It began in the Victorian era, the late 1800s. Before that time, when people went to the Sunday meeting, they would wear good clothes, but not unusually so. We need to make sure that our culture is appropriate for the setting in which we are functioning. This involves so many things, so many stylistic elements, things such as the length of our services and the language we use, the selection of the biblical translations that we select. We must be careful that we are pragmatic, that we do what is most effective in our setting. And the expectations of our congregation. People have certain expectations. For that reason, I would advise preachers to consider carefully how they dress. Even in a congregation where most of the men do not wear coats and ties, there very well may be an expectation that the man delivering the sermon ought to wear a coat and tie. We should be mindful of expectations in terms of the style of music. If we're visiting at a congregation and we are asked to lead singing, we should make sure we know what kind of music they're accustomed to. And the length of our sermons. In some settings, a sermon going for an hour or an hour and a half is not unusual. In other settings, a sermon that goes beyond 20 minutes will wear upon the patience of those listening. The expectations of the congregation need to play a part in the way we order, the way we produce our worship services. Colossians 3:23 tells us, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men." Worship is a good work, and we should embrace it with vigor. We should embrace it heartily. And we should recognize that we are planning our worship services primarily in honor of God. And in doing this, we can make sure that we are following the right course in our worship. Worship is defined by God. And worship is intentional. We should have a plan. We should be following this plan as we organize and as we execute our worship services. Worship is purposeful. We are to honor God. We are to build up our brothers and sisters. We are to reach out to the lost. All of these things are to be done, and since they are goals, they constrain us to plan our worship services and to attempt to execute them according to this plan. We are attempting to worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Thank you so much for joining me for this class. I look forward to being with you again soon.